Welcome to Hence the Future podcast. I'm Mattimore Cronin.
I'm Justin Clark.
And today we're discussing the future of podcasting. Where were you when Joe Rogan moved to Spotify? That's what Theo tweeted recently. And I love that because it really encapsulates how big of a move this is in the podcasting world. So for listeners who don't know, Joe Rogan just signed a multi-year deal to make the entire JRE library exclusive on Spotify starting on September 1st. And in exchange, Spotify is paying Joe Rogan an undisclosed amount that's, quote, greater than $100 million. And his podcast will still be free on Spotify, so it's not like it'll be behind a paywall, but listeners will have to use the Spotify app to listen, which means they'll have to register with Spotify. And that includes YouTube. So full JRE episodes will not be available on YouTube. They'll still have clips on YouTube, but all videos will also be on podcasts. And this is to help promote Spotify's, or will also be on Spotify. So this will be to help promote Spotify's new video component where you can listen to or watch the podcast, depending on your preference. So I guess to start out, I want to ask you, Justin, is this a good deal for Joe Rogan? Is this a good deal for Spotify? And is this good for podcast listeners around the world?
So, to answer the first question, is it good for Joe Rogan? I think the answer is most likely yes. I think that he probably wouldn't have agreed to it if it wasn't a good deal for him, at least financially. And one thing that I've heard Joe Rogan talk about a lot on his show in particular is his concern over YouTube, especially about all of this cancel culture, where basically he can get demonetized, and some of his episodes have been demonetized on YouTube because he had a guest on or he said something that was against YouTube's
Well, he had Alex Jones on, who has been banned from YouTube. So obviously that episode couldn't be monetized.
Yeah, so I think he's probably going into this with conditions, probably along the lines of you have zero say over what I do, and you have to guarantee essentially that you can't cancel the monetization. And if they're paying him $100 million over the course of however long, even if it's over the course of the rest of his lifetime, he'll probably be fine. But
yeah, I mean, it's definitely good for Joe Rogan in the perspective that he's getting a lot of revenue right away.
And he won't necessarily be censored.
Yeah, he's not an employee of Spotify, so he can still have full creative control over the show. And
that's probably what he wants ultimately. Yeah, I'm sure he's...
Well, but he already has that. So, like, the big question is, why do it at all? Like, he's already making $30 million a year on his own podcast. He has full creative control. He's on every platform. He's literally the biggest name in all of podcasting. Like, what more could he possibly want? So part of me is wondering, like, why does he really need to do it?
Yeah.
Because, you know, if he makes 30 million a year, okay, if he's getting 100 million, is that really worth the limited reach that he's probably going to have by not being on every platform where people will have to listen through Spotify? And a counter or an example that's kind of relevant and a lot of people have talked about is Howard Stern. So Howard Stern was the biggest radio host in all of radio. And then in the early mid-2000s, he did a deal with Sirius XM to be exclusive to Sirius Radio, which is satellite radio that, you know, they were in new BMWs and they had deals with car manufacturers. And he was super successful on Sirius, and he made a killing. He made $500 million over 5 years. But how often do you hear people talk about Howard Stern nowadays? Like, almost never. It's like his influence has waned so much. And yeah, he's got really rich and has a really cushy gig. But I wonder if Joe Rogan isn't shooting himself in the foot a little bit by basically giving up influence in exchange for a short-term payoff.
Yeah, See, that is definitely one concern, but one argument or one thing that I've at least thought of for this, like why it could be good for him, is I wonder how much time he spends on either curating ads or anything else related to advertisements, because
Hmm.
I think one of the things that Spotify is trying to do, and might lead into the next question of why this is good for Spotify, is for one, Joe Rogan right now spends at least 15 minutes talking about his sponsors and everything. I don't know how much time he actually spends trying to talk to them, because he might be saving time if he goes to Spotify and Spotify does all the advertising for them. Because right now, it seems like Spotify is getting to this phase where they're going to start using data from listeners to have more specific ads for specific episodes for specific people. And that might be non Joe Rogan produced advertisements that he now doesn't have to think about at all.
Yeah.
Um,
Although I
so
would
that's
say
like
that
one.
if you have someone who's not Joe Rogan reading the ads, I wonder if they'll be even a fraction as effective. Because,
Yeah,
like,
I
when
don't
you hear
know.
Joe Rogan say, like, brought to you by the motherfucking Cash App, like, like that has so much value in itself that if you just have some, like, voice actor reading some ad, I don't think it'll be as effective. And also, I heard from Kara Swisher that he may still have his own ad component. So the Spotify deal, it's hard to talk about it now because we don't know all the specifics. That not much has been reported other than it's over $100 million. But from what Kara Swisher said, he still is going to have ads, his own ads in the beginning of the episodes. And that's one thing that's different about podcasts than music is that with music, if you pay for Spotify Premium, you never have to listen to ads at all. But with
Yeah.
podcasts, because the host actually records the ads themselves, and oftentimes that's part of the episode. That's not like an advertiser slot, like they recorded that into the episode. So
Right.
the listeners will have to listen to ads regardless when it
Yeah.
comes to podcasts. But I think your point about defending Joe Rogan's decision has some really, there are some good arguments in that line. So one I would say is that for him, everyone can still listen to his show. It's still 100% free. You just have to change which app you're using. So it's not like he's really hurting his fans that much.
Yeah.
And if he still has all of his advertising revenue and he still has full creative control over the show, then why not sign on for something like, Jason Calacanis said that he speculated maybe it's $75 million a year for 3 years. It's only three
Hmm.
years of Joe Rogan's life. Why not sort of cash out and do sort of like a podcast VC exit
Uh,
and really sort of cash in on all the work he's done.
mhm.
So I think that there are obviously it makes sense to Joe Rogan. He's not a dumb guy, even though he says that to get his
Yeah.
guests to open up. So
Yeah.
I think whatever the terms of the deal are, it works for Joe Rogan.
Hmm.
One interesting thing is that his podcast will no longer be a podcast because a podcast is defined as a show that uses an RSS feed to be distributed to multiple platforms. If you just
Mm.
have it on one platform, it's no longer a podcast. It's an internet show. So, like,
Interesting.
yeah.
I'm
Um,
sure they'll still call it a podcast, but
oh, yeah, for sure. Um,
wow, that's interesting though.
Yeah, so I think I guess to summarize the Joe Rogan question, it definitely makes sense for him financially. I am not so sure it makes sense for him reputationally or just considering the amount of influence he may give up as a result of
Yeah.
going exclusive.
Yeah, I do think though that the Howard Stern example isn't necessarily going to be the same, because Sirius is a paywall. You can't just it
That's
like you
true.
can't just
Hmm.
listen to Howard Stern if you want to. Changing an app is much lower friction than like now buying Sirius Radio, which is it doesn't even have other good content necessarily, or that some people might think that it's good content, but not everyone thinks that
Yeah,
everything else is good content. So I just think the friction is a little bit lower to switch from, for me, Overcast to Spotify.
right.
Like, no
But
big
it's
deal.
it's kind of crazy though that literally one dude changes his podcast to be exclusive, and now I am literally considering whether I should now use Spotify as my main podcasting app.
Yeah.
And
Well, I
Joe
mean, he's
Rogan's
one of
not
the
even
biggest
like,
podcasts.
yeah, but it's like not even one of my favorite podcasts, but I
Mm,
listen to it enough that
mm,
for me to not see the latest episode that just came out with Elon Musk or whoever,
mm,
whatever crazy guest Joe Rogan has on next, like that's a big of enough reason for me to use Spotify as my native podcasting app. And
mm,
that's huge. I mean, when you talk about like the streaming wars, and the podcast wars between like Apple and Spotify and Google and
mm.
Amazon, that's huge. If you can get people
Yeah.
to use your app as the listening app, I mean, the
Mm,
value for that alone. And by the way, we saw, so I guess now we should get into whether or not it makes sense for Spotify. In one day, one trading day after they announced this move with Joe Rogan, the valuation of Spotify went up by $1.4 billion. So in one day, Joe Rogan more than paid for the whole deal just
yeah.
by raising Spotify's stock value.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense from Spotify's perspective because they need some big players on their platform to get people to listen. If they have a couple of these early movers that are guaranteed to be on their platform and only on their platform, they're basically capturing the entire Joe Rogan market. Let's say 20% of the current Joe Rogan listeners now will never listen to another Joe Rogan episode because it's on Spotify. I think that's probably an overestimate, anyways, but we can say 20% will never listen
Hmm.
again. That's still a lot of people moving to
Yeah,
Spotify
the
for
other
podcasts.
80% will
Yeah.
move to Spotify, and X percent of them will become subscribers for Spotify
Hmm.
Premium.
Yep.
So I looked into where Spotify makes their revenue, and they only make 10% of their revenue from ads, which is people who are on the free tier of Spotify and they have to listen to
Yeah.
ads. 90% of their revenue is from Spotify Premium. So not only are a lot of Joe Rogan's fans going to switch to Spotify, watch ads, and some portion of them will join Spotify Premium, you're also going to be able to use Joe Rogan's face and name and likeness in every
Hmm.
ad that Spotify will run on Facebook to get new people to join Spotify Premium. And
Yeah.
that's huge. Like,
Hmm.
Spotify is basically paying for the mental shift of thinking of them as a music platform to thinking of them as the one stop shop for all things audio.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's really big. And the other point is music isn't necessarily as profitable as
Hmm.
podcasts could be because with music there are middlemen between Spotify and the artists in a lot of cases. There are some like exclusive artists, I think, for Spotify, but a lot of times there's a record label and they have to pay the record label and they have to pay royalties and all of the things every time a podcast or every time a song is played.
Yeah.
With podcasting, it's not the same thing. So with a podcast, basically they have direct control to Joe Rogan in this case, and or not control, but they have direct access to his episodes and his content, and there's no middleman. It's
Yeah.
just the content.
Yeah, like when you think about a song, it's typically short. It's like 2 to 3 minutes long. You
Mhm.
have to pay royalty every time that song gets played to the
Yeah.
artist. And you can probably only play one ad in between songs, if that. I mean, I think they might
Mhm.
only do it like every 2 or 3 songs, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas with podcasts, you literally have like 2 or 3 or 4 hour episodes that can have lots of ads placed within those episodes. So
Mhm.
listeners are engaged and listening for a lot longer. And it's not like you have to pay royalties to the podcaster every time their episode gets played. Typically, Spotify would only have to pay to create the episodes, and then
Mhm.
they can just run those episodes over and over and over again and not have to pay anything else to the original creator. So
Yeah.
this is huge, and it's part of Spotify's strategy. So, they had acquired Gimlet Media for 195 million. They acquired Parcast for 55 million. They acquired The Ringer with Bill Simmons for 196 million. These are all major basically they're podcasting startups that have a lot of their own shows, and these have become Spotify exclusives. And those are enough of a reason for big fans of those podcasts to use Spotify exclusively. They also acquired Anchor, which is what we use to produce our own podcast. So Anchor allows you to basically, create and distribute your podcast. So if Spotify is going to be the place for, top level exclusive podcasts, and the place for people to produce their podcasts and get advertisers for their podcasts, Spotify could become like basically what Facebook and Google is for image, video, and text ads. They could become that mega platform for audio ads.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to the other point of just data. The data that you get from podcasting is likely much richer than the data you get from the sets of music that listeners are listening to. Because if let's say you're diving into some pretty niche podcasts, and there are a bunch of niche podcasts out there, and let's say it's about, I don't know, holistic dentistry or something really niche like that, you're going to get a lot of information about a user, and you can have more targeted ads to that user across the board. And it's one of those things where if it's, we've said this before, if it's free, you're paying with your data, essentially. Like if you don't have to pay for it with money, you're paying with your data. And that's what's going to happen here. And that may or may not be a good thing if this space becomes oversaturated with these ads. But,
Yeah. I see.
I'm curious
People
what your thoughts are there.
Right. Well, I mean, as someone who works in the advertising business, I wouldn't say I'm like anti-ad. And I actually think from the standpoint of an economy, ads are a really efficient way of connecting people with solutions. Because
Agreed.
how else would people find out about some cool, the amount of cool stuff you'll find out about by listening to like Tim Ferriss ads or Joe Rogan ads. Usually they're really good quality products that are really relevant for their listeners, and they've passed the filter of Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss. So I think that if you look at ads in that way, then it's almost like a trusted recommendation that's good for the person listening, it's good for the podcaster, it's good for the brand. It's kind of just an efficient way to connect people with solutions.
Agreed.
So and I think what you're getting at, though, is a major shift that's happening, which is that now Spotify has this feature called streaming ad insertion. And essentially what this is let's say you're a podcaster, like you're Joe Rogan, and you record several different types of ads. Like one could be for, let's say, like a hunting bow for all the meat-eating hunters who listen to his show. And then maybe some other ad he records is for some lion's mane mushroom tea that's nice for anyone who's more about like being healthy and the holistic kind of lifestyle. Yeah. Then based on Spotify's data, they'll see who's listening to Joe Rogan. Is it someone who is more of like a manly like hunter type? Okay, then show them the hunting bow ad. Whereas, is this person maybe it's like a girl who's really about like the environment and health and wellness. Okay, let's show her the lion's mane mushroom tea ad. So they'll literally determine which ad you get to hear based on what they know about you. And a lot of the data Spotify has is what type of music you like, what other podcasts you listen to, and you can learn a lot about someone by what types of content they consume. I mean, think about how much you can know from someone by just knowing whether the main podcast they listen to is New York Times The Daily or The Ben Shapiro Show. I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other, but you could probably make a dozen predictions about someone just with that single data point. And then when you layer on top of that all the other podcasts and music they listen to and who their friends are and what their friends listen to and where they are geographically and their age and their gender and what type of device they have. Like all of this data is available to them, and they could seriously make the podcasting ad industry a real thing, because up until now it's been super fragmented. It's basically been like Wild West of like, you know, people like slanging deals with different advertisers on their own. There hasn't been one centralized hub where you can go to connect brands with podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen in a lot of places that podcasting is just totally under monetized in general right now.
Oh yeah.
So
I mean, here, let's put some numbers on it. So the podcasting industry in 2020 is expected to grow 30%. So it's going to grow 30% this year, which means it will surpass $1 billion for the first time. So that's it. The whole podcasting industry is worth $100 billion. So, sorry, $1 billion. So the 100 million that Joe Rogan got is a pretty sizable portion of that 1 billion, right?
10%.
It's literally 10% of the whole podcasting industry in one deal.
Wow.
Whereas if you look at radio, which we think of as like this dinosaur business, the radio industry is valued at $42 billion a year. So radio is 42x what podcasting is. And like music is 21 billion. So there is so much space for podcasting to grow. It really is like this nascent industry that I think is going to grow to, if it's worth $1 billion in 2020, I think by 2025 it's going to be worth like 20 billion. It's going to be like on par with music, if I had to predict.
Yeah, and just listenership is growing across demographics. Previously, I saw this article that was talking about veteran listeners, which are people that have been listening to podcasts for greater than 3 years, and more newbie listeners that haven't. A lot of the veteran listeners are between like 35 and 55. Like they're much older listeners, and now it's shifting to 12 to 35% is a majority of the listenership. Mm-hmm. And it's definitely shifting towards a younger demographic these days. And that, I mean, that's good. That means that there's going to be a lot of long-term podcast listeners, most likely. And there's no shortage of content. No matter what you're into, you can find a podcast that you like. And I think as time goes on, there's just going to be better and better produced podcasts as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I want to get into those future scenarios too, but maybe before we do, we should say a little bit about how people could go about launching their own podcast and what the current state of the tools are, because I definitely want to spend a good amount of time talking about the future and how new tools, new platforms, and new technologies will create the podcasting world of tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So let's start with how to do a podcast in 2020. So there's a few components that are important. The most important thing in my mind is a good microphone. Like having good quality audio is big, and Justin's microphone's not working today. So Justin's going to need a new microphone. But there are lots of good microphones out there, and if you are on a budget, I would say just get a USB microphone. I use a Blue Yeti, which has been working well for me. A pop filter is also big, so that's what I have here if you're watching the video pod. And this basically, whenever I get excited and I talk about like popping peas and stuff like that, then it will make it so that it doesn't hurt our listeners' ears and it filters out those pops. Mm-hmm. I would also say that headphones are big, and the reason you need headphones, like these are some Sennheisers that I highly recommend anything made by Sennheiser. The great thing about these is that you will avoid any echoes. So if you record a podcast without headphones, and sometimes you'll hear this in other podcasts with guests who aren't used to being on a podcast, you'll hear the echo of the entire room because they're not wearing headphones. So it's important that you wear them.
Yep.
The other thing I would say for recording, we use Skype plus Ecamm movie tools. And this has been like really a great solution, the best solution I've seen out there for this type of thing, because it automatically will record your Skype videos and then create separate tracks. So you have two video tracks, you and your guest, and two audio tracks for you and your guest. So if there's some issues with someone's audio, you can adjust for that without having to adjust the master audio for both of you, which is key. And I'm kind of shocked that Zoom doesn't have an equivalent tool for podcasters. They do have some way to record, but they don't export to separate tracks. And, even though Zoom has better quality for just the audio and video in general, they really don't have a good tool for podcasters. And I'm kind of shocked that Google Meet doesn't have a really good tool for podcasters. So I think Ecamm Movie Tools is the current best solution out there. But I bet you in the next 5 years, there's going to be some way better tool that, like, imagine if we were able to not only record separate tracks, but also like, change our backgrounds if we wanted. Maybe we can pull up videos or like play sound effects or sound bites or invite listeners on to, ask a question in real time. And maybe you can also live stream directly to Instagram or Periscope. Like there's so much potential for making the recording and publishing part of podcasting better. So if you're making one today, I would say use Ecamm Movie Tools. But ask me again in a few months, because this space is changing so quickly that I would expect there to be a really good new tool out there in just a few months.
Yep.
I would also say for publishing, we already talked about it, but Anchor is really a game changer. So 70% of new podcasts in 2020 were created with Anchor. And the real innovation there is that with one push of a button, it will publish it to all major podcasting platforms. So you don't have to spend time like creating an account on all these different platforms, and every time you have a new episode, you got to go to all of them. Yep. The other big innovation with Anchor is that they allow for a little ad placement that will automatically show an ad to listeners based on whatever ads you have loaded up. So for instance, if we have like 3 different advertisers, but we only have 2 ad slots, it will play whichever 2 the algorithm deems are most relevant for that user. So this is something Anchor already has, and Spotify is trying to make that even more effective via their other data that they have.
Yep.
And then maybe you could say a little bit about the current state of transcribing, because this is one area that we have come a really long way, but in my mind, we still have a long way to go. From the time where it's like text first to the time where we can truly have audio first content that's perfectly indexed across the web.
Yeah, so one of the main reasons for transcripts right now is so your podcast episode is indexable by search engines. So people can go online, search some topic, and hopefully your podcast transcription comes up, and then people find your podcast and start listening to your podcast through, that sort of organic search method. So a lot of transcriptions in the past, let's say 10 years ago, were probably completely manual. So you would have to go through and listen and type as you're listening to the podcast. And that's no good.
It's like the equivalent of like hand copying the Bible from like one book to like a blank book.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad we're beyond that, because right now there have been some pretty cool advancements in machine learning that can parse the audio and figure out what people are saying. So one of the tools that we use in particular for transcriptions are so Amazon Web Services has this transcribe service. And there's also been Google Translate, which I think is pretty good, but I think we've had the best luck with Amazon so far, being able to capture like the differences in our voices and all of our guest voices, and being able to segment those users out. But the cool thing is with Amazon is it'll parse your audio and give text, and then you can also select like the number of users that are speaking. So let's say we're doing this podcast right now. You can hand it the audio and say there are two speakers, and it'll try to separate out those two into their own like space. So you can have an easily like conversation.
It's just like how
Worthy.
Sirius sort of optimizes for your particular voice. This
Yeah.
will optimize for like two different particular voices.
Yeah, it like separates out those two voices, so you can at least have, when it gets translated to text, you can at least have something that looks like a conversation. Because one
Hmm.
of the other things with some transcription tools is it'll put everything into words, but then you actually have to go back and still listen to the whole podcast
Right.
again and figure out who is saying what and like press enter and like label, this person was saying this person was saying it here. So it's a much more time efficient way to do these things. And no, it's not perfect, but in terms of the overall goal, which is to make your podcast searchable, it does the job.
Hmm.
And you can add your own vocabulary and stuff, which is pretty cool. But
So it stops
what I think
calling me
is,
Madame.
but yeah,
Madame
yeah,
or Justin.
yeah, Madame or Justin, Madam or Crone.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah. So there's like a few things that it'll pick up on, but I think the thing that we're moving towards in the future is actually directly indexing the audio. And I
Hmm.
think Google is actually getting to the point where it's doing this currently in sort of a low-key way. I was doing some research and saw that Google's been working on direct audio indexing since 2008. So
Wow.
they've been working on it for a while, and it's very likely that that is some component of their search engine already. Um, so that's actually pretty promising. But if audio itself is indexed, meaning you don't necessarily even need to have that middle layer of generating text from the audio and then indexing that text, these search indexes can just directly be indexed to the audio, which I think is really
Right.
cool.
Yeah, and
One of the things, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say I noticed that Apple has this feature already in beta, so it's not released to the world yet. But I saw in my Apple Podcasting app, you can actually type words that appear in someone's podcast audio and see
Mm,
results based on that. So, for instance, like let's say we're doing research for Joe Rogan's deal with Spotify, you could literally type in Joe Rogan Spotify, and it's not only going to bring up the episodes that have that in the title or the description, it'll also bring up episodes that just have that mentioned somewhere in the podcast.
mm. Yeah, and that's, I think
It's incredible.
yeah, that's really where we need to move to anyways, because there is so much content out there
Hmm.
that needs to be searchable. Like if you think about how many podcasts and how many hours of podcasting there are already, like I would say that I don't know if there's a number on this, but probably thousands of hours. I mean, that's just Joe Rogan has thousands of hours of
Oh,
podcasting. So there's
yeah.
probably maybe even upwards of millions of hours of audio content that could be indexed, that could be very useful to people. So, anyways, I think that's something that's really exciting. And, like, for
Yeah.
example, Google has done, I've noticed something with Google and YouTube recently where if I'm searching how to do something, in the search results, usually, or at least what I used to see, is there's a video that pops up like, okay, here's a tutorial how to do this thing or something related to this thing that I'm trying to do. What I've seen recently is it'll actually recommend me some small segment of a clip,
Hmm.
of a video that will show me specifically what I want to do rather than like the whole thing, like the whole
Right.
process, when I only need to know one
So if you
step
want
of
a
the
cooking
process.
recipe, you don't have to hear the backstory about growing up on the farm and everything like that. You can just hear
Yeah,
the recipe.
yeah, and that's ultimately where this leads to. It might get to the point where you can actually just directly go to a segment of a podcast that you want to listen to
Yeah.
rather than the whole thing.
I love this because I feel like it's making podcasts more meritocratic because
Mm.
people can search what they're interested in and then they'll find podcasts that maybe aren't in the top 100 podcasts, but
Mhm.
if they like what they hear, then they can become a fan of that. And we've had a lot of people find out about our show with a similar path where they'll search for a topic, they'll really like our episode, and then they'll listen to our other topics. Right now, a lot of people only stay within that, like, top 20 Apple Podcast chart.
Mhm.
So I think that moving to this form of indexing audio and being able to search by topic and by keyword that are in the audio is going to be
Yeah.
huge for just discovery of new podcasts in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree.
Awesome. So I want to just briefly talk about whether this is good for podcast listeners and whether it's good for people who have podcasts, all the developments in this space. So first, I guess, let's talk about, I guess we already kind of talked about whether it's good for podcast listeners, so we can go past that. And I think basically what we decided is that it's not that big of a hassle because
Mhm.
they can still listen for free. They just need to use the Spotify app.
Yeah.
But if a lot of major podcasts go exclusive, like let's say, Joe Rogan is exclusive to Spotify, the New York Times, The Daily is exclusive to Apple, some
Mhm.
other podcast is exclusive to Google. If all the top podcasts start to be exclusive to different places, then it sucks for listeners because now you have to go to all these different apps and possibly have
Yeah.
multiple different subscriptions just so you can listen to your favorite 5 shows or whatever it
Mhm.
is.
Yeah.
So it is potentially bad for listeners. As far as whether it's good or bad for podcasters, I was listening to Scott Galloway today, and he said every podcast valuation just went up by 50% overnight after the Joe Rogan deal was
Yeah.
announced. And basically, this may be the beginning of a podcast war where major platforms will be outbidding each other to get different high profile shows onto their platform. And those platforms will be investing heavily in trying to win the podcasting ad market and to be the one stop shop for advertisers and podcast
Mhm.
creators.
Yep.
So it's definitely good for podcasters, and even for smaller podcasts that aren't likely to get acquired, it's good for them to just have a more streamlined ad network where you don't have to make specific deals with all different players. You can kind of just go to
Yeah.
one marketplace.
Mhm.
So, anyways, I think that pretty much summarizes it. Now, perhaps we should get into the future scenarios. All right, Justin, what is the worst case scenario for the future of podcasting?
Worst case scenario.
Yeah, so I think the future of podcasting isn't one that is extremely doom and gloom. But there are a couple of things that could happen that I think would sort of at least really annoy me in the space. And the first, like, sort of likely worst case is, let's say Spotify takes over a bunch of these um, podcasts, and it's mostly to do with the advertising. So, for example, when I listen to Joe Rogan, I'm not going to lie, I just like fast forward through all the
Same.
advertising. But what I'm worried about is they might make it like a specific ad
Unskippable.
segment that you can't skip, and you have to listen to like
Unless
10
you're a
minutes of
premium user.
advertisements. Yeah, yeah, and I'm sure that's probably something that is
In the
that might
works.
happen. I mean, I could see that happening. So that's one thing that I think would annoy me. I mean, I am a Spotify subscriber, so hopefully I can circumvent that. But that would be bad in general if it alienates a lot of Joe Rogan's followers. And this kind of my next part is sort of touching on what you were saying earlier, is like Joe Rogan losing influence.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's one of the most important podcasters in the space. I'm not saying he's the best or my favorite, but I think he's the most important because he has the most influence and he offers such a broad range of guests and ideas that he's sort of opening up the general public to certain ideas. I think he's going to be one of the major factors in psychedelics becoming a little bit more mainstream, for example, in terms of their research, because he's very openly for them and uses them himself. But he's also sort of this meathead guy. Like, he can talk with anybody. He can talk with Elon Musk. He can talk with Rhonda Patrick, like these extremely nerdy people, and also comedians. And he just has this broad range. And I think if he loses that influence, it will not be good for society as a whole. So that's kind of my worst case, is specifically about Joe Rogan losing influence.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, he is one of the few people that is really outside of politics. Like, you can't pigeonhole him as right wing or left wing. And, you know, a lot of the quote intellectual dark web has that quality to it. So I also agree that if you lose the biggest figure in viewing all sides and just talking about the issues without any sort of political charges or motivations, then things can get far more polarized, even than they are right now. So I'm concerned about that. I would say in my worst case scenario, many other big podcasts go exclusive as well. So Joe Rogan is sort of like the canary in the coal mine, and a lot of other major podcasts go exclusive. So now you have quality information is no longer publicly available to everybody. It's only available to those who are willing and able to go to that specific platform and who potentially have to pay not to see ads. So in the worst case, this would eventually become something like you have to pay not to be manipulated or not to be given disinformation. And I'm not saying that's where we are right now, because I think, you know, Spotify, I think, is a morally upstanding company. And I don't think they're going to allow like misinformation advertisers and malevolent players on their platform in the first place. But just as a broad trend, if we're moving to a world where people who can afford to pay for no ads can have high quality information without the manipulation, but people who can't afford to pay for premium have to be manipulated and potentially talked into buying things they really don't need to buy, then that's obviously a bad scenario for the population as a whole. I also think there's an interesting concept from Scott Adams where he talks about these digital warlords, which would basically be like you have these figures like Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss or whoever that basically have their own like army of like 1 million or 4 million listeners or whatever it is, and they can basically do deals with advertisers and platforms to capitalize on their listenership. And, you know, that's not necessarily bad, but it's bad just in the sense that it's less open. Like, what's so great about the Apple ecosystem is that it really is sort of a carryover from the early days of the internet, where everything is free, everything is open. We're just providing a platform so any creator can add their RSS feed and be listened to by the world. Whereas what we're moving to now is more of like the Netflix model, where it's all about doing specific deals so that you have the rights to Friends or The Office or whatever. You produce your own shows. You try to capture audience from your competitors. And it's just more of a messy battle where different big players are trying to claw users from one another rather than an open platform where anyone can listen to anything. So that's another area that I'm concerned about. But I would say the single greatest concern I have for podcasting is that what people love about podcasts is that they're unfiltered, raw conversations that are nuanced. They're not your
Mm.
typical like TV news show where you only get 30 seconds to make some point and it's
Yeah.
all just about the sound bites. Like podcasts are one of the few areas where you can actually talk in depth about a topic and, you know, discuss every angle of it, not just come up with like, oh, here's why my side is right, here are the arguments, you know, closed and shut case. So my concern is that if podcasts go exclusive, then all of a sudden they can be canceled. Like I'm not saying Joe Rogan's going to get canceled, but let's say hypothetically Joe Rogan invites Alex Jones back on the podcast and he says something super outrageous and outlandish and everyone's like has this major backlash against Spotify. Will Spotify try to put some pressure on Joe Rogan to change who his guests are or anything else? It sounds like so far that's not part of the deal, but if we move more in that direction where podcasts are exclusive to one platform, it just follows logically that those platforms will have greater leverage over the creator that they've done a deal with. So,
Yeah. I think those are good points. And I was talking earlier about how this audio indexing is really cool because you could listen to specific clips. I wonder if that could lead to a situation where you do only get little baby clips of a much larger nuanced conversation, like you were saying. And that could lead to, again, this situation where, like, yes, the fundamental content for podcasting is a long, nuanced conversation in a lot of cases, but what people consume might end up being
right.
small bites that can be taken out of context and things
Yeah,
along
like the
those lines.
JRE clips are still going to be on YouTube, but you're not going to have the full episodes that have the full context. So that could be a source of misunderstanding.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I get it. That could be bad.
All right, let's move to the best case scenario. What do you think is the best case for the future of podcasting?
Best case scenario.
So, I think the best case for the future of podcasting is just really taking advantage of all of the good things that podcasts are. Like you were saying, it really has improved the conversation and the dialogue around certain topics because you do have this opportunity to have more nuanced conversations. I would like to see that be the case in every sector of society. In particular, I would love to see this in politics. And we just saw Andrew Yang release his own podcast. Because that's one of the things I think we're missing is we're missing these longer, in-depth conversations because these debates don't work. They don't actually get a point across because you can't just have a sweeping solution to any problem because every single problem is going to be much more nuanced and complex than what you can convey on the stage. And what I think Andrew Yang in particular is doing here is leaning towards my best case of anyone who wants to be in politics probably should have a bunch of audio that's publicly available that talks about what they think about certain things. And that should be part of the general research that citizens do to elect who they want to elect into government. So that's just one thing. It's just like how podcasting could improve politics, but it could also improve education. For example, hardcore history could vastly improve how much people are even interested in history. Because when I was in school, I thought history was the super lame subject. And
did you see what he's coming out with? The VR simulation of World War One?
No,
dude,
that's awesome.
He's literally recreating like historical World War One battles in VR that you can go and experience.
Wow,
with
that's
his like with his storytelling and everything.
Oh man, that's what I love about this, and it could lead to this phase, and that might even be another thing is layering on VR to podcasting. If there's a good animation engine or something where you could go in, and podcasts now have like a visual component to them if you want, that could really improve education in general across very complex topics. So if you're learning software engineering, like I have a few data science podcasts I listen to, for example, that talk about really complicated like machine learning models. It would be really nice if that was accompanied by some sort of visual where I could be watching the these videos as well as listening to the podcast, and it would essentially turn into a sort of lecture. And you could really structure curriculum around just podcasts and have people produce really high quality, I don't know, biological introductions or physics introductions through podcasting, because I tend to learn better through audio than through reading. And maybe this is because I'm not exactly sure.
Well, it's so much more rich information because you get tone of voice, you get dramatic pauses.
Yep.
You often have two people sort of talking about different angles of one issue rather than just one lecturer espousing their own beliefs without any sort of interplay.
Yeah. So I think, to kind of sum it up, I just think that podcasting has the potential to really transform a lot of different sectors, particularly education and politics.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And you're so right about politics. It's like oftentimes politicians need to decide, do they actually answer the question and give a thoughtful response about what their healthcare plan would be? Or do they just go for the zinger that's going to look really good on Twitter and YouTube and is going to be picked up by all the networks? And usually, if you're a savvy politician, you go for the zinger because that's what works. That's what plays to crowds. But that doesn't help society if we can never actually talk about how to resolve these issues that are often very messy and nuanced, and there's not one sweeping right answer. It's more of a give and a take. So, yeah, I think in my best case scenario, Joe Rogan is more of an outlier. It's not the norm. So most big podcasts do stay available on all platforms. And I think that is actually fairly likely because you are giving up reach when you go to one platform. So there's always going to be podcasters that it's more important to them to have as much reach as possible rather than as much short-term revenue as possible. So I'm not like super concerned that, starting tomorrow, all my favorite podcasts will go exclusive. I think that's unlikely. In my best case scenario, I think there's a combination of curated ads that really pass the filter of the podcast host, especially if they continue to be recorded and read by the podcast host. A combination of that and the Sam Harris model. Like, I love how Sam Harris makes all of his episodes are publicly available up to a certain point, like the first 30 minutes or an hour or something. But then if you want the full episodes and if you want extra value, like Ask Me Anything episodes and to be the first one to know about his live events, then you need to be a subscriber directly with Sam Harris. It's not through some other platform. So I think that's a really good model if you can make it work, because that way it's like your only boss is your audience, and you have enough audience members that you can do exactly what you feel is right to do at any given time. And no one can fire you, no one can cancel you. So I don't, that's obviously not something that can work for everyone. Like I saw that Tim Ferriss did a Twitter poll where he asked his audience, should I switch my podcast from ad supported to listener supported? And almost everyone voted to keep it ad supported. Now, I don't know if that's because they were just used to Tim Ferriss's podcast being ad supported, or if maybe they just didn't feel like they would want to pony up their credit card to pay him and they'd rather just listen to a few ads. But that tells me that it's not like ads are evil and there's not a good scenario where ads are part of the mix. The important thing is just that that, you know, it doesn't influence the quality of the show at all, and that the only ads that are shown are ads that the host believes in and that aren't manipulative and that are for real products that are verified and all of that, those sorts of things.
Yep.
I would say the best case for Spotify is that they do become a full-blown podcasting ad network that has all of the top tier podcasts. Obviously, that's what's best for them.
Yeah.
And as far as like future podcast technology, I think it would be awesome if we can switch to a world that's truly audio video first rather than text first. So
Yeah.
imagine if you could, like, rather than like finally honing what your business is about through text and getting the copywriting exactly right and all of that, maybe you could just talk about your business for 2 hours, and then it will be, all that information will be perfectly processed and indexed across the web. It could even be turned into a blog post algorithmically to make sure it has like the appropriate grammar and all of that. So if we move to a world where you can really just record audio and video, and then everything is in, like, everything happens pretty much automatically that you would need to have a discoverable show, that would be amazing. And when you get into like machine learning and simulations, I mean, the coolest thing to me would be like, what if you could interview simulations of famous people like Napoleon or Steve Jobs or like Julius Caesar, and you could literally have like a simulated like their voice and their beliefs and, you know, based on their writings, and like you and I could like interview Napoleon and be like, all right, so what were you thinking? You know, you invaded Russia in the winter. Like, if you could go back, like, what would you do now? Like, I mean, that'd
be sweet,
amazing. But I think that's one thing that is unique about podcasts is that no matter how crazy technology gets, people are always going to need to make sense of those changes. So even if everything that logistically needs to happen for the world to function, like, imagine you can no longer make money actually, like, you know, manufacturing items or customer service or anything like that because machines just do it way better. Even in that world, there's going to be a market for other humans talking about the world and talking about the changes and talking about what it's like to live life as a conscious being.
Yeah.
So I think I'm long on podcasting. I think it's going to be successful. I think it's still in the early days. I think there will be a major podcasting ad platform, but it's still going to be a mix. So yeah, I'm very very bullish on podcasting.
Yeah. So is that your
that's
your
my best case,
your likely case as well?
Most likely scenario.
Well, for my likely case, I would say that some big podcasts will go exclusive and follow Joe Rogan and get the payout. Most will not. And I would say that one most likely scenario is that I think podcasts will continue to get more intimate and more engaging with listeners. So, for instance, Scott Adams' podcast is recorded live on Periscope, and he can actually have listeners ask questions and respond and give feedback in real time while he's recording. And I think that's going to become an even bigger part of podcasting in the future, where you can really like have meaningful interactions with listeners either live or separately, like outside of the episodes. I also think that, you know, there's a lot to learn from some of the major platforms such as Clubhouse and OnlyFans. So with OnlyFans, obviously intimacy is the biggest part, where if you're a lonely Marine in some island in Guam, you know, and you need to connect with someone that you feel like knows you on some level and cares about you, that's pretty much what OnlyFans does. But you could imagine something like that for podcasters, where it's like you're sort of part of like the VIP crowd. And there's this other app called Community where you can literally, like, I can text Chris D'Elia and he'll respond. and this is like an app where you can have that like closer level of connection to your fans.
That's cool.
And then as far as Clubhouse, like the cool thing about Clubhouse is that it's basically like a way to passively hang out with other smart people in an audio format. So you can open up your Clubhouse app, just put it down on your table, and then while you're doing work throughout the day, you're listening to like a VC, a biotech founder, you know, some other like really interesting person, and they're all just talking about issues, and you're kind of just like hanging out with them, and you can join the conversation and actually talk, or you can just listen to other people talk. But I think especially in the world post-COVID, where people are more isolated and there's more of a need to self-quarantine, having those avenues where you can make meaningful connections, and it's not just consuming a show like you would with Netflix, but it has some element of really engaging and being part of a community. I think that's the most likely scenario for where podcasting will end up. And I just want to end my most likely with a quote from Elon Musk, where he described Twitter as plugging into the stream of public consciousness. And I view podcasting in very much the same way, where just like Twitter, it's like you're plugging into the stream of consciousness of the thinkers and the thought leaders that resonate with you. So I think that's going to continue, and I think the more we're able to strengthen that stream of consciousness and allow it to freely flow to people, then the better positioned we'll be to share ideas, to overcome differences in viewpoints, and to create a better collective future.
Wow, yeah, I think that's really good. And I guess just to round out, I would say I am also extremely bullish on podcasting just as an industry, and my best case is almost exactly my likely case. Like, that doesn't happen very often, but I think that it will be used to transform a lot of different sectors of society. And we already see it with Andrew Yang, and we see certain educational podcasts coming out that are really good at distilling complex information because they're just well done, and we get to hear the best of the best rather than someone that's maybe in a school district without very good teachers. Maybe they can just tap right into the best teachers of biology or history or whatever it is, and they can become very well educated and very informed on specific subjects. So I'm very optimistic about podcasting in general. Yeah.
And just so you listeners know, this is episode 96, and for episode 100, we're going to do something special. That will be the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2. And we've got a lot planned for you guys in season 2 to have an even better Hence the Future experience. So if you have any ideas for that, feel free to email us, hencethefuturepodcast@gmail.com. And thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
The past, the present, hence the future.
Our computer is picking up a strange signal.
The past, the present, hence the future, baby.
What's the world coming to?
The past, the present, hence the future. The past, the present, hence the future, baby. The past, the present, hence the future.
Well, it has this manipulated consciousness.
The past, the present, hence the future, baby.
Behind the strange signal is an alien
The
intelligence.
past, the present, hence the future. The past, the present, hence the future, baby.
It's possible. Future.